Good afternoon, testing. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. By way of introduction, my name is Tracy Sinkamba Foster, and I'm the International Research and Project Management Coordinator at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. We're based in Paris, and I will be your moderator today. I'm based in Paris, France, born in Toronto, Canada, and Guyanese and Zambian heritage. So in the languages of my background, bonjour, hello, and muli bonji. So just over 6 months ago, in the IGF in Poland, an open forum on harmonizing African regulation for cross-border data flows was held, and some of the participants on stage today were party to that session. Some key takeaways from that session were the AUC data policy framework, still in draft at the time, was groundbreaking in terms of developing a more inclusive digital economy with increased participation from the continent. Recommendations regarding investments for skills training and infrastructure were shared during this discussion, which reimagined Africa as a producer as opposed to a consumer in the global digital economy. Since then, much has transpired. The AU Data Policy Framework was adopted by member states in February of this year, and a series of multi-stakeholder workshops has just been concluded on the framework's implementation plan, which includes an inventory to guide its successful execution. The pace of the materialization underscores the political will and determination to realize the objectives of the digital transformation strategy as they pertain to the creation of the digital single market by 2030. So for today's panel, we have once more invited some of the best minds who are at the coalface of the ever-burgeoning data economy, as we deliberate on improving collaboration to ensure the timely implementation and domestication of the framework. I am pleased to introduce our panelists this afternoon. So on my right, I have Dr. Alison Gilwald, Executive Director, Research ICT Africa. Varenga Mabika, who is online, and he is the Senior Policy Advisor for Africa, Internet Society. On my right again, I have Benga Sesan, who is the Executive Director of Paradigm Initiative. And online joining us as well is Priscilla Boagwe, Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager at Google. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Gilwald, who will briefly introduce to us the framework and its implementation plan. So over to you, Dr. Alison Gilwald.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I think it's a big ask in the little time we have to capture the data policy framework, which is really a comprehensive framework that covers not only data protection, which people often assume when we speak about data policy that we're only speaking of data protection, but of data, non-personal data as well. The document is a very high-level principle document that creates a framework for member states to progressively realize the objectives of the framework, which are precisely, as you've indicated, in line with the digital transformation strategy, committed to creating an innovative and competitive and more equitable digital economy and society. The framework has a number of principles around collaboration and cooperation of member states in order to meet the objectives, not only of the single market, which is obviously critical in terms of equal participation of countries in the trade area, in the common trade area, but also principles that will allow us to govern data more effectively across our countries, also for the not only at the continental level, but at the international level, enabling the flow of data that enables economic participation and activity, but at the same time mitigates any harms that could be associated with those data flows. So creating frameworks that would enable those kinds of flows. The framework, I suppose one should add, is a little bit different maybe from other data policy frameworks. Of course, most of the data policy frameworks were initially data protection frameworks. And of course, we now have the more broader sort of data components captured in some of the Digital Services Act and those kinds of legislation, regulation that's emerging in the European Union and other parts of the world. But this framework is very specifically located in a development paradigm, and in a paradigm of trying to address some of the very uneven distribution that we see in economic opportunities and other opportunities, and the uneven distribution of harms that we see. One of the greatest harms, of course, being the very kind of mass exclusion of large numbers of people and effectively whole economies from this modern digital economy. So there, there are concepts of data justice in this. It, of course, is human-centered, and it's rights preserving, and that it gets its mandate from international declarations of rights and, of course, African declarations of human and people's rights, Internet Charter, and so on. But the document actually moves beyond that by addressing some of the second and third generation issues that very often allow people to address those, to exercise those first generation rights. So really looking at some of the economic inequities and how one might, what economic regulation you could introduce in order to ensure access to information, for innovation, for information, a regime that would allow for greater participation, more equitable participation in that economy. So the document is framed in terms of these high-level principles. It looks at some of the essential foundational infrastructure. And I think this is, again, another distinction, from some of the other data policy frameworks that we have that assume that there's sufficient in place for us to all participate equitably in that environment. So it looks at the need for digital broadband, your digital infrastructure, your broadband infrastructure and services. It looks at the need for data infrastructure, which has a slightly different notion of infrastructure than digital infrastructure, and that it tends to refer not only to the data assets, but also the data governance frameworks that you need in place. And then it also refers to the need for digital identity infrastructure, in that we, not going to be able to participate equitably unless we're able to, identify ourselves online in order to access government services, private services, financially transact, etc. So there's the kind of foundational infrastructure, and then it has a component that looks at data economy, data value. It looks at understanding that data is a probably impure public good, but it's a public good and it's non-rivalrous and potentially non-excludable if in certain circumstances you can create an open data environment. And as such, it has a very particular role to play in a developmental context. And particularly, of course, most of the data value is driven by private value creation. And part of this governance framework is to create a regulatory environment that will ensure, or hopefully move together with global initiatives on ensuring that that's not as extractive as that has been in the past, but that it's more, equitably shared value creation. And of course, the kind of getting fairer benefits, getting better, more even benefits, getting more fair and just outcomes from that is one of the objectives. How we do that is obviously critical in the implementation that we were speaking about. And then the really sort of detailed section on data governance looks at some of the areas that are more classically associated with data governance, data protection, the need for a secure environment in terms of data security. But then it also looks at really increasingly important governance issues of portability of data, not only for consumer choice, but for increasing numbers of platform workers that we see in Africa, having the right to take your labor elsewhere if the conditions under which you are not working are not optimal for you. And then, there is a very detailed section on data governance. And all of these components of the framework are then being translated at the moment into an implementation plan for domestication by countries. As I said, countries can use the implementation plan according to their needs and their context. The implementation plan has the strategies that one might deploy for those different components to see the objectives that we've spoken about in the framework. It identifies the actions, the responsibilities, the capabilities that one might need and the capacity one might need at an institutional level. And then it has some very broad indicators that one might use to assess success or achievement of those goals or progress towards those goals. As I said, it's going to be very different for different countries. And that implementation plan is currently is being worked on by the AUC and will go to a member state validation workshop at the end of the month. And accompanying that, my last point is that there are two supporting complementary tools. The one is a capacity self-assessment tool. And this is really in a response, an AUC response to member state requests that, we keep lamenting the fact that we pass conventions, we pass policy and we don't implement them. I mean, there's specific reference in the document to the Malabo Convention, which would have taken care of a lot of things, but now is actually already out of date. But then we've got as I said, the capacity self-assessment tool would allow countries in each of the areas that we've discussed to identify what their needs are. And then in a next phase of work, a program would be developed to try and respond to those in ways that can work with regulatory networks, that can get regulatory peer mechanisms, that can do online training for certain kinds of operational type institutional building that one might be required. And then there's a monitoring and evaluation tool which countries can then take into their own context, apply their own budgets, their own targets, and develop their and use the indicators in order to assess their progress on those targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gilwald, for sharing that with us. And I'd be very interested to hear from our esteemed panelists what your thoughts are, reflections on the implementation plan. And first, I would like to turn to Benga from your perspective, from Paradigm Initiative's perspective as well, what your thoughts are on the implementation plan. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad you asked about the implementation plan because, this is not the first time that we're having conversations around what could be a framework for the continent. Mentioning the Malabo Convention sort of makes me sad. It makes me sad because not only was it a unique opportunity for countries that were just starting out to adopt, because that's what most countries do anyway with legislation. You take a copy that exists, you change and I know that from many of the countries we work in, because some of the draft bills still have the old currency in it. So we weren't surprised, for example, in the early days in Nigeria when we had rupees in some bills, rupees because it was adopted from India, anyway. So it's not the first time we're doing this. But what I like, a few things. One is the fact that the implementation guidelines are practical. And I think it sort of puts in a lot of peer pressure and removes the excuses. Because if your excuse is we don't have the capacity, there's a tool for that. If the excuse is, so how exactly do we implement this? There's no template in terms of how do we assess ourselves, there's that already. So for me, I think the fact that this, and of course, this also benefits from the fact that by nature, it sort of had contributions from more stakeholders. It wasn't something that was drafted by some ministers and then tossed down, take it or leave it, our way or the highway or something like that. So that also helps. But in terms of implementation, I think that because of COVID, which in itself isn't, it's bad news, but has forced us to realize the value of two key things, data and trust. Everyone knows that if we sort of ignored the place of data before, we can't do that now. Considering the fact that during that period, the only places that things were happening, the only place where everything was happening was online during the lockdowns. And the amount of data, and I keep saying to people that we generated much more data during the lockdowns for many individuals than they did the entire career until then. because you were on Zoom recording videos. One video call for 1 hour is equivalent to almost 1 year of emails plus other things you've done. So literally you're generating that massive amount of data. And if we didn't pay attention to that before, now we will, because it's very clear. And the second is in terms of trust. We've had major challenges, and I like that you made a distinction between data protection and data policy, because I know there's been a temptation for us to think only of protection because we are reacting to the challenges. But now that we've had a chance to step back a bit, to look at the entire policy, allow me to use the word that has been used too much this week already, ecosystem. You know, the entire ecosystem of data policy, not just protection, not just what individuals should do in terms of the life cycle of their own data, but the fact that we now have the chance to look at that entire space is very helpful, because what it does, and I hope, and this is my hope, that countries will now take advantage of this. I know we know that there's a difference between countries saying we agree on this and implementing it. But the beautiful thing is that now we sort of have a sort of peer pressure mechanism where we can refer. It was a bit difficult with the Malabo Convention because people had to ratify and you could use those numbers, and it wasn't, but now, even if it's not something that you're taking to your country to say we're going to work exactly this way, you can take bits and pieces from it. You can decide to say, you know what, the first thing we need to do is to do our capacity assessment. And that I find extremely interesting, by the way, because many countries have been deceiving themselves in terms of capacity. We just launched our London report for 2021. And what you will see is that this report covers 22 countries. And if you overlay that report with the one we did last year, November, on data protection authorities, which, the first data protection law, 2001 from Cape Verde, so it was 20 years. If you look at that, you would see that many countries literally start data protection projects because of, some say for security reasons, they have to start gathering massive data, collecting biometric information. And it's while doing this massive projects, including in countries with tens and some of them maybe a few 100 million citizens. And then during that process, they realized that, listen, the cart is before the horse. We haven't actually talked about the life cycle of this data, who handles this data, and all the policy issues around it. So I'm hoping that this policy is not just one of those things that we will mouth as ticked off, but that countries will find extremely useful. And I'm sure that various stakeholders in each country will be able to hold each country, to hold their feet to the fire, to say, listen, this is adopted, right? It's like the constitution of the country. If you go against it, well, not quite like the constitution, but something close to that, something that you've sort of admitted, we are responsible for the implementation of this. And I think that's where the juice is for me, that we can ask questions 5 years down the line and say, listen, 2021, 2022, this was a conversation. This is 2026, 2027. Are we still having the same conversation, or have we made progress? Because 2030 isn't far off. We want a single market in 2030. Hello, it's just 8 years.
Thank you very much for your insights and perspective. I would also be, just to bounce off what you were saying, to hear from Princilia, who is online. If we can put on the video screen, I think it'd be interesting to hear from Google as well, what they think of this implementation plan. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to join you all virtually from Kenya. Our office is here in Kenya. I think this framework is really, really a positive step. And we should really congratulate the Commission and all those involved in the drafting of the framework. Are you able to hear me okay? You can hear me okay? Okay. So it's really a positive step. There are so many really critical pieces that companies like Google have been pushing for, that we're happy to see in here. The language around cross-border data flows and interoperability, cross-border cooperation. All of these are things that are going to ultimately help to accelerate Africa's digital transformation. And at the end of the day, that is Google's goal here on the continent. We face a lot of issues around, the lack of physical infrastructure, around human capital development, around tech adoption, and also around, are you able to hear me? I just lost your video footage.
Hear you good, Princelia.
Okay, great. And around a pro-competitive regulatory environment. For us, those are our policy priority areas for the continent. And I'm really happy to see that the framework speaks to those 4 aspects. So around the need for increased connectivity, to get more people online, the need for digital skilling and helping to develop, to integrate digital skills across different sectors. All of these are really core skills that we think, key policy areas that we think help governments to accelerate economic growth and the digital transformation in their countries. I think there are some areas where, I think there needs to be a little bit more conversation. But I think the most important part of this is that it will start important discussions between governments and also the private sector. And we're very excited and eager to participate in these kinds of discussions because there's been a lack of a mechanism to facilitate that. So we'd like to see how, for example, we can build on this framework to support governments as they are drafting out and implementing these plans. That's something that we really want to see. Some of the requirements around data localization, those things to us are issues that we'd like to be able to discuss, and so that governments can really see what would the impact be, in their actual countries if we were to implement some of these, and how that impacts data sharing, for example. So overall, I think it's very positive, very practical, and very tangible methods. We're happy to help. We'd like to play a helpful role in the implementation of this framework. And I think it'll ultimately achieve the goal that we all want, which is the economic growth of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Princelia, for sharing those insights with us. And then I'd like to turn over to Varenga, who's also online to share some of his reflections on the implementation and also the framework. Over to you, Varenga.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Tracy. I hope you can hear me clearly. Please
I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, I would like to echo my colleagues' perceptions on this development. So firstly, I would like to congratulate the African Union Commission for developing this framework. And most importantly, I think the implementation plan, I think it's an interesting tool and to give some kind of direction on how data could be collected or processed, and most importantly, managed in our continent. I remember in the last few years, there's been very, very slow ratification of the Malabo Convention. I think my colleagues have mentioned this. And some of the reasons that were mentioned for this slow adoption was, of course, the lack of implementation modalities, that once a member state is ratified, what do you do after that? Do you have any guidelines that can come with it and stuff like that? In fact, at Internet Society with the African Union Commission in 2018, we developed the Africa Privacy and Personal Data Protection Guidelines. And the intention really was to motivate countries to quickly ratify the Malabo Convention. So now with this framework and the implementation plan, I think it's going to be much clearer and easier for countries to also even, reflectively go back and, be motivated to ratify the Malabo Convention. I think one thing that I could also mention, because I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have said, is that at the moment we are seeing our continent moving at speed to harmonize a lot of things. Some of you may remember the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is very positive development. The single African air transport market, I think, is one of them. I think there's an initiative to the free movement of persons, and of course the digital single market. So if you look at all these initiatives that are moving at a very in the positive direction of opening up the market. They come with a lot of opportunities for data governance and data processing for different players in the market. So I think the idea of a framework for data governance is really quite important in also realizing these initiatives. So definitely from an ISO point of view, we are also very much motivated with this development, and we'll be happy to support the initiative in any way we could. I like the aspect that there is also a big component of capacity building or capacity strengthening, whichever you want to call it, and I think it's in the positive direction. So I think let me pause there, and probably we can have a much broader chat on this development. Back to you, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Berengai, for that. And perhaps I'd allow our panelists, before I hand over to Dr. Gilwald, to maybe react, if you want to one another. If you have any thoughts, again, Benga. Otherwise, I'll give it to Dr. Gilwald. Yeah? Okay, great.
I'm sure panelists have got lots to add here, and thank you to them for also prompting me into just commenting on some aspects of the framework that perhaps I've glossed over that would actually be useful in terms of the points that they've made. Perhaps most of all, to indicate that I've spoke about this enabling framework, and very much, I'm afraid, drawing on the idea that we have to address this ecosystemically, that we actually, and certainly, from a policy point of view, that we have to be looking at a transversal digital policy that cuts across sectors and stuff. We cannot address this as many countries are trying to do, within the traditional ICT sector, comm sector, telecom sector, whatever it is. So I think the enabling environment that is a critical core of the framework actually speaks about the alignment of existing law and policy with the data policy. It speaks about the rights framework that you need in place in order to create a trusted environment. That actually just data protection and cybersecurity on its own don't deliver trust. They deliver a safe and secure environment, but they don't necessarily get people online unless there are guarantees that people are confident to go online because they're not going to be surveilled, or they're not going to have their data extracted in an unaccountable way, or that they have no say over, or it's not going to be protected. So there's a core aspect of legitimacy to trust, and there's also an acknowledgement that there are different political systems and there are different ways that trust is built and created. But I think it's important to acknowledge that simply because you've got data security, you don't have it all sorted out. So I think that's an important part of it. And in that component about this enabling environment, we also draw on concepts of data justice. And that is, acknowledging as I said, these extreme inequalities we have between countries and within countries, and trying to redress those. And then again, I'm not sure I've made the point well enough, but when I was speaking about the progressive realization of the objectives of the framework, and with the ultimate objective of a harmonized, single market, that we could benefit from the economies of scale and scope that you need in a data economy. It's very difficult to get data value out of the Malawian market all on its own. No matter how well it's regulated or incentivized. So that, I think that's an important concept of that, is that actually full harmonization is a long, it's a long haul. It's a big process. We're in very different places, but there is actually low hanging fruit. And I think if the focus is, that we're on this continuum, and that we could actually, just by agreeing on a set of continental standards, categorization of data, etc., that would allow immediate kind of interoperability of our national integrated data systems, which is also a critical part of the framework for countries' implementation. Then we could see some of those benefits, cross-border flow benefits, etc., better and more equitable, although I think there's quite a lot of work to be done there, participation of different countries in the free trade zone and those kinds of things. And then just to say, in relation to the data governance issue that Priscilla was raising on the thorny issues of data sovereignty and data localization, is that, I think there's a lot of work being done now, and the data policy framework draws on that, the data governance section draws on that, in understanding the importance of data sovereignty, both from a personal point of view, for data subjects, sovereignty of the data, and having agency over who can actually, how that data is used, which is, I think, is a big challenge in terms of the kind of, dominant, or what are regarded as best practice notions of, so informed consent and those kinds of things that require, I mean, I don't think many of us in this room can actually work through an average Google informed consent document. So I think we really need to explore what that means, where we have very low digital literacy, where we have very low literacy, where we can look at other forms of data stewardship than these kind of highly traditional and legalized notions. And then, of course, we see data sovereignty at the national level very tied to issues of data localization. So acknowledging that there are dimensions of data sovereignty, and that these have to be acknowledged if we're going to address some of these inequitable aspects of cross-border data flow and concentration of data in different parts of the globe and within countries as well. But what we draw on is a concept of data control, and a very continuum of data control. And one might think of that as, hard data localization and protectionism at one end, and kind of open data at the other. And that, according to the circumstance, the kind of data and whatever, you would move your control up and down that control continuum in order to optimize or to balance the public interest objectives, to balance the individual objectives against possibly collective interests, or public interest in a crisis, or whatever the issue is. But I don't think they're irreconcilable. I don't think acknowledging data sovereignty means that you've got a protectionist localized framework. You could have, as long as you're ensuring that the data is going to an environment where the receiving nation has reciprocal conditions, that could be sufficient for personal data flows. There's a whole lot of data, non-personal data that one could immediately allow to flow that would enable, cross-border support non-digital services and that kind of things in cross-border trade and that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot of detail in some of those aspects that I think some of the tensions, they're acknowledged, but there are ways of resolving them that both allow countries to meet their the national interests, and also, very importantly, the last point I wanted to make on that is the issue of global governance. That although this is about there's a lot of regional responsibilities, not a lot, but there's some regional responsibilities that are identified for the African Union, the standardization that they could facilitate to get in place quite quickly. There's a particular role for the RECs, for the regional economic communities, to support the domestication and implementation of the strategies of the framework. But a very important aspect of this is that data, internet, cybersecurity, these are digital global public goods. We cannot govern them or manage them, as a single nation state anymore. If we want to actually make sure that our data, our citizens' data, is safe on a big global monopoly platform whose servers and everything else, taxes, whatever, elsewhere, we have to be able to engage, to collaborate at a global level, to ensure that we can actually assert those national rights, those sovereign rights, collectively at a global level. So I think the global governance dimensions of this are very important within the framework. And there is the obvious appeal from this is that African countries need to engage far more actively and effectively in these forums of global governance, whether it's on trade or taxation or data governance. We need to, there were times in our history in this area where we had strong African caucuses on different things, telecom standards and technology standards and those kinds of things. And there just really is not a lot of, firstly, African participation, and secondly, very little collaboration among member states, African states, in many of these global forums.
Thank you, Alison, for that, for responding to as well the comments as well from the our panelists. And I'd like to throw it out there to those that are here or online to maybe react if you have any questions to what you've heard already. Otherwise, I'm going to be asking some questions. So please let me know. Anybody? No questions from the floor. Okay, so who is my first target? Oh, do we have one question? Okay, so one question. Maybe I'll come to you, Benga, because your work at Paradigm Initiative is on better connecting the African youth and improving the livelihoods through the digital inclusion. So the question I have for you is, what levels of skills and awareness that young people need to be afforded in order to unlock the potential of the framework in the lives of the youth?
So before I come to that, I wanted to touch on something that Alison mentioned that I think is pretty important. I could sense the sort of near disappointment in your voice when you talked about those caucuses that we used to have in terms of global governance, and I think this is and I think it's really important. I'll give a practical example. This is the Africa IGF, right? The IGF holds in November, December. And you would naturally expect that conversations flow from national IGFs to sub-regional IGFs to regional IGFs and to the global IGF. But we don't have that continuum. We don't have that deliberateness to the policy conversations. In fact, in many situations, you have people arriving at the global IGF asking questions like, what are we discussing? And I find that so first of all, I think it's a waste of my time to come all the way, make time for like 7 days to be together, or 5 days. And you're asking me as a person in charge of policy in my country, that what are we discussing here? Because that tells me many things about how unprepared you are and how unconnected all these conversations are. And it becomes a lot more difficult now that we have, we don't have silos. So when we had a silo of the Ministry of Communications, Ministry of Trade, it was a bit easier to manage that because there was a desk in that ministry. But now you have this interoperability that is expected. And unfortunately, we don't have, so I think we, apart from some of the conversations we're having, we also need to keep, like hitting the nail on the head when it comes to that continuous policy conversations, not only tying it to what happens on the ground, but making sure we don't show up at the IGF without an agenda. Because clearly every country comes to such conversations with an agenda. And if you don't, it's the reason we end up voting. You go to the UN, systems, and you'll find out many of the, country delegations are busy having meetings with another country's delegation that is selling the idea to them. And when it's time to vote, the tough ones like South Africa abstain when or Nigeria, but others, if you look at the board. So I do this, and this is, please don't tell anyone, this is a secret. When we're at these meetings, I look at the meetings that happened the previous night, and I can tell how the voting is going to be. You see the lobby, you see this country from West Africa, this country from Central Africa, meeting with this country from Europe, and I know that tomorrow they're going to vote in support of something they haven't thought about. They haven't, in fact, in one of those cases, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy had a fight on the floor because one delegation, anyway, that's not the question you asked. But I just feel very passionate about that because I think, you know what, this is a lot of our time that we're investing in this. For what we do at Paradigm Initiative, I think one thing that is very clear, I mean, it's very clear in terms of skills, people need to understand digital. But the good news is that we're talking about a new generation that is almost a generation you can define as digital natives. Not all, because the lottery of birth also determines how you're called a digital native or a migrant. You could be born in 2022 and still be a digital migrant, which means you have no idea how to use digital devices. Alison and I were having a conversation earlier. I mean, my kids are 7 and 4, and they can use computers. During the lockdowns, of course, it was tough with the 3-year-old, but at least they had Zoom, meetings, and it was like play group, Zoom meetings and serious work. But think of the kids that had no access, which basically means that not only did they forget what they learned in school before the lockdowns, they didn't learn new things. And now, one critical skill that most of the young guys and ladies have picked up now, which is independence, the ability to move around. I mean, my son is telling me what to do. He's 7 and he's telling me what to do on my MacBook when he uses a PC. I'm like, this is disrespect. Calm down, young man. but that's the way it is. So that's one critical area of our work, to make sure that at least those young people who are otherwise won't have that opportunity are connected to these opportunities. But I think one overall skill that we must all work on is policy engagement. Because there's a temptation, and this is the way it is, as a young person who grows up in a country where you sort of literally take care of yourself by yourself. Unemployment is high, power situation is terrible, internet is annoying. So you sort of develop this negative attitude towards policy, and you're like, elections, my votes don't count anyway. Policy, I don't care. But I think we need to teach a lot of young people in terms of how to engage policy. It will take a while, but it's very possible, and it becomes increasingly easier now when you engage certain institutions that before a bill becomes law. I mean, just as we're sitting here today, 2 hours yesterday, there's a startup bill that was drafted in Nigeria by a group of young people and some government agencies, and it passed through the Senate yesterday. Well, hopefully it goes through the House and becomes law, but they had a chance to contribute to it. So I think this is one fundamental thing we need young people to pick up: policy engagement. You can't assume that your expectations cannot be accounted for in discussing conversations around policy. Because to be honest, and I know we have a very connected policymaker in the room, but there are so many policymakers who literally have no idea what they're discussing when it comes to digital. And we hear this all the time. A policymaker is saying to you, this digital thing, it's dangerous. Somebody is going to use it to abuse me and things like that, because that is the area of digital they've sort of interacted with. But there are tons of other areas they haven't interacted with that the new generation of young people know. And if they don't participate, we will continue to have a blind spot as far as policy development is concerned. And then we'll continue complaining again that it was a terrible policy.
Thank you for that, Benga. Then maybe I should turn to Vrengai, who's online with us. And from the Internet Society perspective and your perspective, what policy advice would you give to those governments that are nascent in their data governance journey? Over to you, Brink.
Thank you, Tracy. You can hear me, right?
Can hear you well. Thank
Great.
you.
Great. Thanks for the great question. I think the governments that are still at that stage are actually the majority in the region, and most probably this framework provides a great opportunity to leapfrog, because it is some of the, I think my colleagues mentioned this, quite tangible things that you can actually do on the ground. The implementation plan is very clear on some of the things you can do. Some of the recommendations probably that I can just put on the table is, firstly, I also think that the Malabo Convention, of course, I know there is an effort to update components of it. I think could be one of, especially for those countries or those states that have not yet any policy framework, probably a Malabo Convention could be a good opportunity to also ratify, because now we sort of have some kind of supporting mechanisms that could that could help to implement some of those things. And then of course I think the digital transformation strategy itself, which I think the data framework is actually coming out of this. I think it's more of a holistic strategy for our region, for Africa, And I think there's a very specific drive towards a data-driven economy. And I think there is an opportunity, especially for policymakers, to capitalize on this, capitalize on the technological innovation that are sort of espoused in the digital transformation strategy. So I think there is quite some opportunities, and whichever way a country or a government may want to go, all the aspects that we have talked about, like the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, if you are thinking of going the single market, all of these are initiatives that could, motivate our governments to really take a very active role in data governance, because it would definitely come with the need to understand how the data is going to be structured, how it's going to be managed, how it's going to be processed. So I think this is quite important. I can also reflect a bit on one aspect that was mentioned here on the aspect of data sovereignty or digital sovereignty. And I think what we are also noticing is that most of the measures or the issues around digital sovereignty are actually manifesting themselves as policies that are targeted at the internet, either trying to exert some kind of control on the internet. And I think the need for government to localize data processing and storage, and also sometimes also promoting competition or local tech industry to prop up because of the foreign companies that we do have. I think it provides another opportunity again, that in the discussion of the digital sovereignty or data sovereignty issues, there is a close link with data governance in there. So I find these few aspects as opportunities that our governments can actually capitalize on. And I would really, I'm hoping that within the period that we do have for the digital transformation strategy, of course, we're just left with about 8 years now to 2030. And I'm hoping we can see a greater interest from our legislation or our policymakers to actively engage in some of these processes and actions.
Thank you very much, Varengai. And before we close the questions, just to inform you that Princelia is no longer on the line, but I would like to see maybe Dr. Gilwald, you can bring us home with some of the responses you have or reactions to Benga and Varengai before we close up.
Thank you. I'm very sorry we've lost Princelia, because it would be nice to get her response, seeing as I'd prodded and poked a little. It would be nice to have got that response. Anyway, yeah, I think the points that Benga and Varengai have made really just are a great endorsement of the potential of the framework and the implementation plan. I don't think it's flawless. These political documents, they're compromise documents, and I think people often fail to forget that when we're talking about a Africa framework, we're talking about 50 plus countries that we are seeking some sort of consensus on. This is not like Latin America, it's not like Europe. So this is an enormous challenge, and also enormous diversity in the development stages, political systems, etc., that you have on the continent. So this is it's a massive task, but I think we've got a really good working framework. I think it is progressive by international standards. I think how that framework is taken and implemented in countries will really depend on how progressive it is or not. And I think, it's really up to the multi-stakeholder processes that are, that are available in those countries to ensure that in the domestication process, there is, these very, I think, universal principles that are in the framing document are carried through into practice. And if that is done with the support of these tools, and hopefully the support for the kind of capacity that has been the major blockage to implementation of good policies and conventions and things we've had in the past. Hopefully by the identification and the ownership of those capacity challenges and how they can be addressed by member states, we can actually move ahead, from nice sounding policy to actually more equitable and just practice, which I think is really what we are hoping for. If we don't, I mean, I think people have said this on many platforms in this conference and others, the cost of not getting this right in Africa is just too high. And I think particularly, in a post-COVID, if I can do that and hold fingers and whatever, but also in acknowledgement that, there's the inevitable next pandemic that we have to be better placed for, to allow Africans to be able to digitally substitute and to mitigate the crisis in the ways that Gibenga's children have, or countries in the north have been able to do during the crisis, but in fact so few Africans have been able to. So I think that's the challenge. There's a lot of work to be done ahead, but I think we've got some working tools that we can progress with.
Thank you very much for that. And we're going to close the session for now, but there is an opportunity to get in touch with us, and if you have further questions regarding the implementation plan. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our participants, our panelists, and also to the audience and for those online for joining us for these discussions. It is evident of the passion which surrounds this topic, and this energy which will be galvanized to bring the framework to life in regional economic communities, member states, and the lives of their residents. So I'm sure that I speak for everyone in attendance when I say that it is enlightening to hear, to learn, and reflect on the priorities as far as the implementation and the framework is concerned. It has also been an inspiration to learn about the potential action plans and also the next steps for the framework. So a big thank you to the audience, as well as for your curiosity and the questions that you have posed, that we have posed to the panelists. And I want to take, again, another opportunity to invite you to participate in the Internet and Jurisdictions online survey on data gathering exercise for an African regional report that we'll be doing on cross-border digital policies for Africa. For more information on that, please do not hesitate to come and see me. There is an online survey, and this regional report will showcase some of the legal and technical approaches to cross-border digital policies, and we're very happy to have Dr. Alison Gilwald and her team as well behind us. But on the AU data policy framework and the implementation plan, which we've been discussing today, this is a collective effort, and there is a role for everyone to play. And together with RIA, Research ICT Africa, and GIZ, we would love to hear from you regarding the status, the readiness, and the potential of your home countries with regards to domesticating the AU data policy framework. So thank you again for your time. And with that, I close and have a good afternoon.